Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on This Is CDR this week. I think we still have some people coming in, but we'll just go ahead and get started with a little intro. So today, OpenAir is really happy to present another episode. I think it's our 80th of This Is CDR, which is an online event series in which we explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal or CDR solutions that are currently being, that are currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and contextualizes them for policy proposals as we seek to advance them at every level of government in the US, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. If you're new to OpenAir, OpenAir is a distributed volunteer network which is dedicated to the advancement of CDR solutions, which are essential to solving the climate crisis. And we have a growing global community which collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of policy, innovation, communications, and activist market development. So please do join us. Chris, I think we'll be putting some links in the chat so you can check out the different missions that OpenAir works on and look into joining us if you're interested in being part of the group. So as I said, OpenAir has a bunch of missions. You can see some little thumbnails of what they look like, but they really cover a broad range of things. Whether you're a technical person, a policy person, or just anyone looking to contribute your skills, you can learn more about them on the OpenAir website and just see where you might want to fit in. Just in case anyone is new to CDR or carbon dioxide removal, we always like to start out with a definition to make sure everyone's on the same page and to sort of avoid any conflation with things like CCUS or offsets or avoidance of emissions. So what we like to talk about when we talk about CDR is any anthropogenic activity that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably stores it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products. That definition comes from the CDR primer, which is a great resource you can find online. I think Chris will put that link in as well. And it's a great place to get started if you are new to CDR or looking to sort of learn about the different pathways and some of the issues around it. We also do have one mission that is very much in progress right now in California, which is SB 308. If you're in California and you're interested in getting involved in that, I think Chris will put those links in as well, and you can look into, there's a call tool that we have, I think, that will sort of help advocate for SB 308 if you're in California. So everyone in California, please have a look at that as well. And then in Massachusetts as well, we have SD 371, which is the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. So again, if you're a Massachusetts member, please join that one and find that on the website and some of the links Chris will send out as well, and see if you can support that effort as well. All right, and now I'm going to hand us over to Emily, who will introduce our panelists and tell you a little bit more about the run of show. Emily, yeah, all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Haygood. I work on the research team at Heirloom, another direct air capture company. And prior to this role, I was at Arizona State Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. Super excited to be here just with a moderator hat on to introduce Octavia Carbon. And for some housekeeping notes, our format is going to be a short presentation followed by a few prepared questions and then a moderated audience Q&A. Please type any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box, not into the chat. They are different, so just be careful where you're putting those questions. This event is being recorded, and we'll send the video link to everyone who registered and also post it to the OpenAir website and YouTube channel. This week, we're pleased to welcome Octavia Carbon founder and CEO Martin Freimüller and product lead Duncan Kariuki to discuss the company's plan for deploying direct air capture in Kenya and why they believe Kenya is the best place in the world to scale direct air capture. Martin is the founder and CEO of Octavia Carbon, where he leads on strategy, sales, and fundraising. His background is in strategy consulting at Dalberg Global Development Advisors, where he also served as the firm's global CDR and carbon markets expert. He holds a BA and MA degree in management and political science from the University of Cambridge. Duncan is the product lead at Octavia Carbon, where he leads the engineering design of the direct air capture machines and tailors the tech to its deployment in the Kenyan context. He has a background in machine element design and manufacturing from Isuzu East Africa and the Kenya Space Agency. He holds a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Nairobi. And now for the main event. Please take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, as I said, as we heard, I'm Martin. I'm the founder and CEO of Octavia, and we're here today to tell you a bit more about our approach towards building low-cost direct air capture in Kenya And it is such a privilege to be on This Is CDR. We have very close links with OpenAir that just noticed putting this presentation here, and even the logos have a slight resemblance, which is entirely coincidence, I promise. But yeah, I think the other thing that's just important to say from our side very quickly, so we had the very special privilege of having a sort of 2-day back-to-back, first on Scrubbing the Skies yesterday, and then today on This Is CDR. And we did think that rather than saying many of the same things twice, would really focus the sessions on slightly different topics. Where yesterday, as you know, we are talking about the Center for International Carbon Removal Law and Policy, and we focus a lot more on policy and some elements of the economics, especially on talent. Today, we really want to focus a lot more on tech and energy. So I will say that today will be much more Duncan's session than mine, given that he's the one who actually builds the machines. But to jump right in, just very quickly, again, we've heard about the need for CDR and carbon removal. I think to most people here will be quite familiar term and why we need it. Very quickly on direct air capture, I think direct air capture is often sort of seen and perceived as very high quality carbon removal, in as much as it is very sort of quantifiable, very measurable, and also very, very permanent in the sense that we can store carbon that we capture durably as rock underground. And essentially, like the way it works, direct air capture or direct air carbon capture, as the name suggests, filters CO2 directly from air. It's essentially in our design a two-phase process. There is a capture phase where essentially fans pull air through, in our case, the sides of the machine. And those sides have filters that then sort of chemically bind to the CO2. And then later, in the later stage, we actually then release that CO2 using low-grade heat. And then it can be stored very much, as I said, in geological reservoirs, or in a sort of longer-term view, it can also really replace every fossil atom of carbon in the global economy today, which will be another key use for direct air capture some years down the line, and very much part of our vision for like building out this industry and green industrialization in Kenya. But much as DAC is a familiar term to many, I think there's also like some quite familiar constraints that DAC faces. Crucially, DAC is an energy-intensive thing, and that is ultimately rooted in thermodynamics. So thermodynamically, there's a minimum work, give or take 125 kilowatt hours per ton of CO2 that you have to put in to get a gas as diffuse as CO2 from the atmosphere. Then to touch on a few others, there's limited options for storing that CO2 durably and geologically. And that also means that DAC is somewhat geographically constrained to having that right geology. Then one thing that many people know about DAC is that, at least today, it is quite expensive, so that is often coupled with the statement that I'll say already, that is coupled with the promise that as an engineered solution, it can come down in cost uniquely quickly, and we'll touch on our approach to that just now. And then crucially, like another constraint to DAC, especially many places in the global north, is community acceptance, and also like the perception, and that's often not entirely unjustified, that it has very close link with the oil and gas industry, and that can create certain questions as well. But one thing that we would say is that we can solve these constraints, and we have really approached Kenya as a place where we can solve all these constraints as a company. Crucially, it is true that DAC will always be energy intensive, and I will touch on that in a bit more detail just now. But crucially, energy is not the same thing as electricity, and that means that we can use heat from geothermal, for up to 90% of the energy need, which has been very successfully demonstrated by Climework, when there's a clear kudos that goes out to them for piloting that. And we really see that as a very promising approach that in a place like Kenya, which has ultra abundant geothermal heat, we really want to build out a lot further and really make that a unique sort of focus technologically. A few more points to say here, like Kenya also has very good geology to permanently store CO2 all along the East African Rift Valley. And that's, by the way, not just Kenya, it's also Ethiopia, and essentially like 4,000 miles of area with the right geology and energy to really build out this industry at scale. And then crucially, there's another piece here, which is talent. And we, I would say, as humanity, know how to make clean tech cheap. We have done it several times before. We've done it for solar, we've done it for batteries and for wind, etc. But the point is that there's one common ingredient to all of that, and that is global South ingenuity and talent. especially around manufacturing, also around things like infrastructure, where that can really make a big difference. And both of these are very relevant in direct air capture, which in many ways has a lot of manufacturing and infrastructure built into its very essence. And then finally, one crucial differentiator of building out DAC in Kenya versus elsewhere is the fact that DAC in Kenya can have very strong co-benefits. So really, alongside having climate benefit, we can also have development impact. And that is, of course, really important both for policymaker buy-in. We are very sort of instrumental for eradicating waste capacity and waste heat from the Kenyan geothermal sector, therefore making geothermal more bankable, allowing the build out of that sector and allowing the government to hit its target of build out renewable energy in Kenya from the current 93% all the way up to 100% by 2030. Take note, Americans, and then, well, pretty much everyone else. And crucially, like, there's also like really strong livelihoods creation from this that will take place in some of the areas on Earth that are hardest hit by climate change. The Horn of Africa is just coming out of a savage 5-year drought that put as much as 10% of Kenya's population are dependent on food aid for the first time. And as such, is really something that DAC can uniquely, address in a way that is mutually beneficial. Of course, it's not the be all and end all of climate justice, but it is a really important factor that's worth mentioning for us. And I do want to touch on one point here in a bit more detail. As I said up first, like, energy is something that we want to touch on a bit more in this session. And that is for one really important reason, because we would argue that DAC fundamentally is renewable energy arbitrage. So again, this is slightly economics heavy here, but the idea is that essentially what direct air capture does is it trades off carbon removal with renewable energy, right? And I think there's often questions around it, like, how much renewable energy do we have to spend on this, right? And there's both answers to why Kenya is ideal for DAC today, given that aspect, and also crucially, why Kenya is ideal for DAC in the long run as well. And I'll briefly touch on both of these, but crucially, as I've mentioned earlier, we have a lot of waste electricity in Kenya. Like, we currently curtail as much as 1 gigawatt hour of geothermal capacity per day. That is sort of like base load renewable electricity supply that is really ideal for powering something like electricity hungry as direct air capture. And we have a lot of waste heat, and that waste heat alone can take us to megaton scale, having run the numbers for where that waste heat is today. And then finally, another really important point around that energy is, waste heat is not unique to Kenya. You have waste heat in, say, bioethanol plants in the American Midwest. But one thing that is really crucial is that waste heat is also co-located with storage, meaning you don't have to transport CO2, which is always going to be a very expensive and also very carbon intensive endeavor to do. And that is, put these together, and then from an energy perspective, you can say, well, clearly Kenya is a great place to do DAC today. It has a lot of renewable electricity, has a lot of renewable heat. That's both of those are currently wasted, and crucially, we can store that CO2 very soon as well. But if it was just that, if it was just, again, where do we start building DAC? That would be one thing. But in as much, and then the temptation might be to say, well, once the rest of the world builds out renewables to, say, 100%, maybe DAC can just happen everywhere, right? But I would say that is somewhat of a fallacy, right? Because in as much as DAC is always going to be closely linked to renewable energy availability, you also really have to look at where do you have really good renewables across the stack, basically. Where on earth do you have your best renewable energy availability to actually scale this a lot farther? And crucially, waste heat, and as we said, waste heat is up to 90% of our energy input, which means that we have uniquely low OpEx, by the way. That means that that low-grade heat, it's debatable whether it's waste if you're putting it to productive use, is available in hundreds of gigawatts from geothermal sources. You will find no cheaper and less carbon-intensive source of heat and of energy, more broadly renewable energy, than geothermal heat that comes directly from the Earth's core. And it is available in East Africa at a vast scale that will enable us, if we so choose, to remove humanity's cumulative carbon emissions from the atmosphere and then also store them in the abundant geology to do so along the East African Rift Valley. that is a really crucial promise here. Beyond that, and it's really important to say again, the heat is a big part of the ingredient that in the kind of DAC that we're building. But also like electricity will play a part of it, at least in the sort of like medium term, but very likely also in the long run. And we know that solar is likely going to be one of the lowest cost sources of renewable electricity in the long term. And it's already getting a lot, like it's getting very, very cheap as a source of electricity. But crucially, like you also have to look at, okay, where is the best place on Earth for solar, right? And Kenya does not only have strong solar irradiation, which is really important, means you get a lot of heat from, get a lot of electricity from that panel. But also one thing that is really, really important is that given that Kenya and much of East Africa lies right on the equator, comes at very low seasonality. And seasonality really matters because it increases the cost of your solar a lot elsewhere, because you have a lot of supply some parts of the year and very little supply other parts of the year. But crucially, given that DAC is quite capex heavy, you want to really like run that machine off that cheap energy as long as you can in the year, which is why that seasonality makes such a big difference. And then finally, and I'll just touch on that briefly, northern Kenya especially has some of the best wind speeds on Earth, enough to put even the North Sea to shame. And crucially, why does that matter? It matters because in the long run, there's a really interesting potential here, which is that next to regenerating your filter in direct air capture, and there's a number of ways of doing that, but that is arguably the biggest cost driver in DAC. The other big one is to actually expose CO2 to that filter. And generally you do that with fans, right? And those fans generally fade away quite quickly because DAC is today quite capex intensive. And that means the more you can sort of like utilize that filter, and essentially you do that better by just driving more air through it using a fan, the better capex utilization you have. But in the longer term, as the cost of that capex falls a lot, and again, that promise is there with modular technology, the potential really is that you can actually use some of that wind to actually drive the exposure of the filter to CO2. And that creates a really interesting thought experiment, which is there's this notion out there that DAC will always be expensive. And let me challenge that quickly, because essentially there's three elements to the cost of DAC. There's the capex, then there's the OpEx for regeneration of the filter, and then there's the OpEx for actually driving air through that filter. The capex does not have to be cheap. Ultimately, what comprises our machine is a bunch of steel and a bunch of organic chemistry. Again, how you structure that chemistry and how you put that together into workable machine is very hard, right? It's very hard today, but crucially, there's no inherently expensive inputs. As we scale up that industry, those inputs can become very cheap, and as the sort of manufacturing of those inputs becomes mainstream, those costs can fall a lot. So that's capex. Then there's the OpEx of regeneration in Kenya. That can be low-grade heat, and which again we have ultra abundantly, and again not competing at the low-grade heat reservoirs with other uses of that heat, meaning that is ultra cheap. And then finally, if we have a scenario where we could even use wind to actually saturate that filter, you essentially can drive the DAC cost of that towards zero. And that is a bold statement to say, and it's frankly up just to prove that this is feasible. But when people ask us, what is the price floor for our DAC? The answer is zero. The price floor for DAC is zero. This is more of a thought experiment. The fans are likely going to pay for their way a long time. And there's, of course, the burden of proof is on us to actually build that out. But I think it is a really important part of shifting the narrative in DAC, basically, that DAC does not have to be expensive, but DAC will be a location-specific industry. Crucially, you do not have those ingredients. You do not have the very strong winds. You do not have the very low-cost geothermal energy, and you do not have the talent to actually build out that manufacturing and infrastructure very cost-effectively everywhere on Earth. So that might actually just mean that DAC as a type of clean industry will fall more towards critical mineral mining, right? You can get copper from a lot of places, but frankly, only a few of them are actually cost-effective. And that is really just such an important point that we really want to drive home here. Kenya is not only ideal for DAC today, Kenya is ideal for DAC tomorrow and in the long run. And that is really just because our thinking here is, in as much as DAC is a form of renewable energy arbitrage, where you really want to go where you have renewable energy in abundance. And there will be some places on Earth that will have that much more than others for today and in the long run, which is why we are so convinced that Kenya is the best place on Earth for DAC. And on that note, I'll hand over to Duncan, who will explain a lot more how we actually do it. Yeah, over to you, Duncan.
Yes, thank you, Martin. And so Martin has one thing he forgot to mention around the energy is that renewable energy penetration in much of sub-Saharan Africa and for Kenya specifically is quite high. Installed capacity in renewable energy is is around 93%, and it's slated to grow to 100% by 2030, which matters as we deploy this technology. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing has been around how we design our technology to leverage Kenya's endowments. And so we over the past year, we've been developing the technology, and we have developed it's a patent pending approach that uniquely relies on very low grade heat resources. So we are talking about waste steam at very low pressure. And we've designed our technology purposely to be highly modular, which allows us to iterate very quickly and mature the technology quite fast. And also this allows us to basically leverage mass manufacturing to drive down the costs of the capex of the technology. We're also very fortunate to have an innovative storage partner in Kenya here. The name is Seller Mineral Storage, an American company, but their first deployment is here in Kenya. Next slide, please. And I'm sure this is what everyone has been waiting for. Process diagrams, everyone loves to see them. So I'll very quickly explain the entire process of DAC and storage. The two main inputs, that's geothermal waste heat and geothermal electricity. For our process, we have very modular machines, very modular units, which you'll see in just a bit. And essentially, within each unit, we have adsorption and desorption phases taking place. And this each machine is fully autonomous. It's driven by sensor readings that feed the control system and actuate the different processes within the machine. We then take the CO2 from each modular unit and we'll take it to a centralized purification plant. And when we get the CO2 from our DAC machines, it's not at high purities because it does have elements of nitrogen and oxygen within it. And essentially what we do during purification is we remove that excess nitrogen, and then we liquefy it, both to purify it further and get rid of the non-condensable gases, and also for storage. At this point, we then hand it over to our storage partner, Seller, and from there they take over and do the CO2 injection. So these are some of the units that we built. We have built 5 at-scale machines. We started out with our prototype Thursday, which we call Thursday, and it's great because we open source this on the OpenAir community, and now it's being built by people all around the world, and it's something that we're really proud of, and we're happy to give back to the OpenAir community, which funny enough is where my journey began. And we built other units. We've iterated the design. The high modularity allows us to make significant shifts in our design based on the test results that we get. And our final unit, which we built 2 of and are gearing up to build a third of, is a 10-ton AR model, which we call Lenana. And this 10-ton AR model is the one that we'll build out at scale for our pilot plant, which we are calling Project Hummingbird. And here is the pilot plant. It's the culmination of the past year's work and what we're going to do over the next year. We're looking to bring this online over the next 12 months. It will capture about 1,000 tons of CO2 a year. And we've partnered with Seller, who will essentially do the storage for us. As you can see here, it's these modular units, the 10-ton AR models. We build 100 of them and array them in a plant. Sort of the analogy here would be a solar farm or wind farm. And essentially each of these units dissolve CO2 and it's taken to a central processing facility, at which point we will then give it, hand it over to Seller. we also have a great team. Octavia is now a team of 34 people, highly motivated people to really build this technology at scale. This is a testament to the employment creation that DAC can create in Kenya. And that's why we have a lot of policymaker buy-in. And over 90% of our staff are under 30. And unemployment is a really huge problem for young people in Kenya. And we're super proud to be able to create all these meaningful jobs for people. And every Octavian who works on the team is really proud to solve one of the greatest problems of our time. And DAC in Kenya, other than the actual benefit of the climate benefit it creates tremendous co-benefits, as Martin had alluded to. And for us, we really see this as climate justice, because Kenya has been adversely affected by climate change. As Martin had mentioned, we've come out from a 5-year-long drought. What it looked like is the picture that you see here. This was a community engagement session that our storage partner Seller and us had done with the local community around where we'll deploy. And this is what climate change looks like for communities in Kenya. Basically, land devastation, economic devastation. For my own parents, it meant their taps running dry. And being able to do this in Kenya gives us a sense of agency to not only solve the problem for ourselves, but also for the world. At this point, we'll welcome any questions. I'm sure there are many, and we've really had a great time talking you through what we've been doing.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. And yeah, so we're going to start with a few sort of prepared ones from the OpenAir community, and then Emily will come on and take some of the ones from the audience. So yeah, please keep the questions coming, and Emily will get to those in a minute. But yeah, I'll start with a few first. I think we always like to ask everyone who comes on, just can you tell us a bit about both of your personal journey towards being involved in CDR and DAC, and kind of how you came to work on Octavia?
Duncan, you start us off.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, so for me, the journey basically began when I was still studying engineering. I come from a farming community in just north of the city, of the capital city, and basically had seen climate change, the effects of climate change firsthand in the community I grew up in. And so I went into engineering basically as a way to solve problems. I find engineering as a very effective tool of solving society's problems. And I basically decided to use my skills to solve a problem that the people I've grown up with have been facing. So I naturally went towards direct air capture, and then joined the OpenAir community as a first point of contact, where we met Chris. And when Martin moved to Kenya to start a company, he met us there.
OpenAir has its fingerprints all over, which is partly why we're so grateful to that community for actually getting us to where we are today in such a short time. For me, the journey started with sort of the question of like, how do you create, I think the number was 30 million jobs for young people in Africa, basically. It's like, I used to work at Dalberg in International Development Consulting. It's the classic sort of moonshot type questions that we would sort of bounce around. And my answer at the time, knowing the climate science, was that carbon removal will surely be one of those job drivers this century. And over time, I realized that for one, that air capture is a great way of actually getting to that carbon removal. But I also realized that Kenya is clearly by far the world's best place to build it. And I did the logical thing and moved my life out here to start a DAC company. That is just shy of 2 years ago. And then we got started in earnest 15 months or so ago. And we've since grown a team from 3 people on sort of my living room table, then Duncan, Mike, and I. And we're now, 34 and growing very strongly. And I think really proud to push the envelope on what's possible on DAC globally.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, and then just in terms of the technology itself, I know you talked a bit about it, but I think a lot of our listeners are pretty familiar with, different DAC companies out there. What are kind of the main key things that you think differentiate the way you're approaching it from things our listeners might have seen elsewhere?
So for one, on the technology side, we've tailored our technology to basically integrating with Kenya's geothermal, and particularly around integrating with low-grade heat. And so a lot of our innovation is around how do we effectively distribute low-grade heat, that's low pressure. For us, it looks like low-pressure steam to effectively supply the bulk of our energy. Beyond that, we are also working quite heavily in a highly modular design. Our machines are extremely modular, which we purposely chose to do so just to advance the technology and drive down the technology risk, as well as iterating quickly. And that way we have seen we've been able to mature our technology. And the other thing that is hardly talked about is we call it the process side of DAC, or the operational side of DAC. We chose from day one basically to build at scale, and that's because there are thousands or hundreds to thousands of parameters that you're always optimizing for on the process side. And so we've been able to innovate very heavily on what we call the process side of DAC, around questions like creating vacuum, moving air effectively, having effective heat distributions, minimizing leakages, etc. And also even around getting high purity CO2 purity concentrations. And so those are the major innovations that we've been driving towards over the past year.
Great. Okay, thanks. And then just thinking about some of the things you were saying, Martin, earlier on why Kenya is such a perfect place, could you just kind of run through what are the characteristics that make it so great? Maybe anything you haven't touched on yet? And then, if any, what are kind of some of the challenges that people, most of our listeners, I think, are in the US or Europe? Are there any unique challenges that you guys might run into that people might not be aware of? And I think you're still on mute.
Classic. Great question. And in a nutshell, it's three things, which is energy, geology, and talent. I talked to them a bit earlier. Co-benefits is another one that's really important, maybe not so much in the cost, but also really crucially in like the mandate to build this out here in Kenya. What I would say on top of that is, again, like the energy point is just really key. And I think, I've talked a lot about it, but what it means is that we can essentially like really innovate on bringing the cost back down, even for like from that first installation that we're now building. And that is something that we really see as a mandate that we have as DAC sector, right? Because the whole promise of DAC, expensive today, but low costs potentially in future, is to deliver on that iterative cost decrease, right? We have failed if we don't bring the cost of DAC down very, very substantially by 2030, because that is crucially why people fund what we do today, often at very high prices. And so really we take up that mantle and really just want to push that boundary very heavily. The challenges though, of course, building this in a very new geography is exciting, and it's definitely great, but it also means that Kenya, can absolutely compete on cost, and it can compete on speed. Kenyan policymakers are very committed to helping us build this out very quickly, and did a lot of talking about that yesterday. So encourage people to check that out. But the thing that we struggle on is, of course, subsidies, right? It's hard for a Kenyan government to subsidize DAC at the same level as countries elsewhere would, right? And beyond that, even the availability of financing, not just in government grants, but also in the availability of debt finance, the availability of equity that looks for seed stage, early stage companies in the African context. I think finance is, if anything, the largest disadvantage. And I think in that sense, we have been extremely grateful to our partners who really see that essentially their funding can be really catalytic, helping to build out DAC in Kenya, which is a very great place for it, but of course also somewhat more starved of the crucial funding, especially at this early stage, to really help it take off. So again, challenges and advantages, but definitely an exciting journey as well.
Yeah, and I think I've heard you think about that before a bit, this idea that subsidies from certain governments who maybe want to bring these jobs domestically and that industry domestically might kind of distort the market and essentially might mean that from a climate perspective, we're not really building DAC or CDR in the most optimal places. Can you just talk a bit more about that idea and kind of how you think is the right way for it to play out? Because, you know, even over the last year or two, there's been a massive acceleration in the subsidies in particularly the US and a couple of places in Europe.
Yeah, and then just to be clear, like we don't think that those subsidies are a bad thing, right? Like we want to really help this industry take off very quickly. But I think it is important to think about this in the long term because the costs of DAC really matter. I think the costs of DAC as a very scalable approach to taking CO2 out of the atmosphere like are super important. And what's really crucial to say there is that, you know, much as there's like very generous subsidies available today, that nobody's under the illusion that those subsidies will be there at 2, 3, 4 billion ton a year scale. And in that sense, we really have to start thinking about, okay, where does it actually make sense to build out that industry, right? And I think, again, to the credit of private buyers, I think that's maybe like a call to private buyers everywhere. Like, you know, of course, we have to think about additionality, right? Additionality really matters for carbon markets. And crucially, like on the category of financial additionality, the US government, and we think, again, it's great, just spent $1.2 billion of grants on DAC, right? And if you're a private buyer of DAC credits, like think what your financial buying power are. There's few private buyers that can match the US government in sort of scale of purchases. Think about where the additionality is greatest. And arguably that will be greatest in geographies like Kenya that do not have the same access to sort of public funding to take off. But then we can leverage those commitments from private buyers to really access catalytic capital to get to scale. And I think, of course, that is something really important to think about, like where is that spending most additional? And again, we do see a lot of resonance from like, you know, what we do on that metric as well. And yeah, I think ultimately when you compare costs, think about unsubsidized costs, right? Like if you are like a sophisticated buyer, there's a lot of them, I'm sure in this audience, then really like try to tease out, okay, like, you know, what is the level of subsidy, whether, you know, from equity funding or from grant funding or other sources that actually like is factored into the cost of what you're buying. Because crucially, like if we are not going to look at unsubsidized costs and, you know, like who can produce at the lowest unsubsidized cost, we might as well not spend extra on DAC at all, right? Like the whole point of spending on DAC is to get it down the cost curve today. And so it's really, really important to look deeply at who actually like has the biggest contribution to taking it down and then really allocating funding there to accelerate those approaches. And again, we think on that metric, people will look at, say, what we do in Kenya and what others, you know, might do here in future, and really realize that a country like Kenya has a lot to offer to the global space. Because again, ultimately, we would argue that DAC is a location-specific industry. Other countries, you know, might try to like capture it, but, you know, we've seen from past waves of clean tech, you know, solar being like a really key one, where in the long run, you can't like, you know, you can't ignore economic fundamentals. They will come to assert themselves. And if we want the spending that we have today to be catalytic, and, you know, frankly, there isn't that much that we can spend on bringing this carbon removal down the cost curve, then we should really look to, like, you know, where the long-term prospects are greatest. And again, our argument would be that Kenya is such a place.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think it's a compelling argument. Okay, and then just thinking about the local communities, you kind of mentioned this earlier as well, but how do you actually make sure that, you know, when we have all these great benefits coming from the industry, that they actually come back to sort of benefit the local economies and communities and the people who sort of are investing into it? And what are you know, I think in general, but specifically also, what are you guys doing to work on that? Because I know it's something you've thought about.
Yeah, for us, the way we work towards maximizing the benefit to local community is through community engagement. So we've already begun talking to the local communities in the area that we are deploying our pilot plant in. And essentially for us, it's we just want to understand what the communities need and try and see how this project could benefit local community, whether it's around questions like capacity building for members of the community, or even other things like access to some resources that they might lack. So community engagement, we've already begun this. We've had one session that was led by a storage partner. We are also going to essentially have somebody within the community who would be the point of contact for the local community to understand what are some of the concerns they might have, what are some of the benefits they'd like to see out of this. And essentially it would be a member of the community who would essentially work with us as a point of contact. And that way we see that we can have a very responsible deployment and bring the uplift the entire community around that site.
Okay,
just add to that very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Megan. I think the point I was just wanting to add to that is that community engagement as a term assumes two things. It assumes that communities have to be engaged because you're part of them, and it also assumes that like engagement is a sort of temporarily singular thing. Like you go to a place and you then talk to that community. And I think we would like to challenge both of these premises. We think that you should look to be part of the community and you should look to do it continuously, right? And in that sense, like the point is community engagement really needs to people need to think that they have like a stake in the success of that project. People need to take pride in that happening, and people are absolutely taking pride that a Kenyan company is like leading locally and building this out. And then frankly, you just need full-time resources that actually make sure that those communities are coming along. It is very easy for misinformation to spread, and you will not get rid of misinformation by just rocking up once and just having a fancy PowerPoint presentation. You will actually have to commit time over a long period, and then really just show that what you're up to is sincere and can actually benefit the community.
Yeah, I think that's a good lesson to anyone working on this anywhere in the world. Great. I'm just going to ask one more question before I let Emily take us over some audience ones. Can you just talk a little bit more about the broader ecosystem in Kenya around CDR, storage partners, any kind of infrastructure, pipelines, the broader environment? I know Octavia's kind of led the charge in a lot of ways, but it seems like there's been more things springing up over the last year or so.
And it's a truly exciting time to build DAC in Kenya. We have great partners throughout, Kenyan government, up to the president himself, is very enthusiastic about the potential for DAC in Kenya. Kenya's climate change envoy, practically our John Kerry, is acting as an advisor to Octavia, really showing that the government wants to get their hands dirty here, which is just fantastic. And yeah, we're working with them to really develop a very fit for purpose policy framework that can work both, at scaling DAC in Kenya quickly, but also doing it, of course, in a way that's fit for purpose and safe. And then beyond that, we have Seller as a storage partner. That is a unique point of pride for us, and the advantage to be the only DAC company that actually has a storage partner that's sort of settled in the same country as they, and very close ties there with Corey Patterson, Seller's co-founders from our earliest days as well. And so that's been really fantastic thing to build out alongside them. And beyond that, James Mwangi is one of the big leagues in carbon removal. As many of us know, Bilha and Irangu is building out Great Carbon Valley as really just the mouthpiece of DAC in Kenya. And so I think there really is starting to be a fantastic ecosystem of players. So I think we hope that many people will come to Kenya in early September for the African Climate Summit, at which point we really hope to just showcase what a mature ecosystem outside, some of the usual suspect actually looks like. And that is really a key point of pride for us to build DAC in Kenya, and having had some role in getting that ecosystem off the ground as well.
Great, that's really great to hear. And Emily, whenever you're ready, I think we've got quite a few audience questions, so I'll let you take over this.
Yes, we do. So I'm going to dive in on some of the very technical ones first. So first up is Sanjeev's question: what's the type of sorbent you're using? And with waste heat, what's the temperature for regeneration?
Yes, so we use a low temperature approach, low temperature swing approach. So we use amides as our sorbent, material solids supported sorbents, or solid supported amines. We regenerate at around about 80 degrees, but we have a path to pushing that lower and opening up the sources of waste heat that we can basically use for regeneration of our solvent.
Gotcha, thank you. And then another kind of hard tech question from Mike: what purity of CO2 are you trying to reach for geologic storage?
So there's purity on two parts. There is purity at plant level. That one would be 95% or north of 95%. And that's what we give our storage partners, liquefied CO2. From what we model, it will be roughly around 97%. On the DAC side, CO2 purity is around about 70%. And that's the other elements are basically water vapor, nitrogen, and oxygen.
Thank you so much. Zooming out a little bit, Orazio asked, have you tried to estimate the potential carbon removal in Kenya, and what would you require to achieve that potential? So like long-term scaling up, how big do you think you could get within Kenya?
Martin, you take this one.
Great. It is honestly hard to say what the limits of this would be. I think it is important to think about CDR limits, like what the limiting factors might be or might become. But I would crucially say that as far as we can tell right now, it is hard to see the CDR capacity at less than the need that we have for it globally to reverse climate change, frankly, to remove and store all of humanity's cumulative carbon emissions to date. And there is literally 4,000 miles of geography that we can tap into for the right geology and energy to build this at massive, massive scale. And, like, that's just, applying the lens that we have on this today. But crucially, with hundreds of gigawatts of geothermal low-grade heat that we can use to power the bulk of our process. And then beyond that, really just, vast swathes of, field for of solar that we could deploy into this as well. It is honestly hard to say what exactly the limits will be. We do think that, at least sort of 2 to 3 gigatons per year is very possible. But beyond that, it's like, honestly, yeah, I mean, again, it's important that, I'm open to challenges there, but I would say it's unlimited. And yeah, very happy to continue a conversation with everyone who wants to have a friendly debate on that topic.
Sounds good. Moving into some more geopolitical kinds of questions. I know that you touched on several. Can you elaborate if there are any more that you haven't talked about yet? And also specifically, are there land or water conflict concerns for having large scale projects in the region?
Great question. So renewables, there is some that I haven't touched on yet, which almost sounds like we placed that question, but it is a great question. So there's about 6 gigawatts of hydro potential that are also highly feasible in Kenya. Of course, with climate change, you have to see like how you can actually build that out over time. But that is, I think currently we've built around about 800 megawatts of that. So it's like space to expand that quite massively, which is of course also really important in giving you that 24/7 renewable energy that you would like to power DAC. We touched on wind, we touched on solar, we touched on geothermal, and all of these are really, really great in Kenya. There's few places that combines the renewable stack quite like that. And yeah, so I think all throughout that, that is really a reason why it's great. Land and water conflicts, great question. Crucially, our process does not require water inputs. And sellers process will require some sort of geothermal brine, essentially, that's non-potable water to form carbonic acid that will then be injected underground as part of the hybrid injection approach. And then really important to point people towards seller for those questions. But what I would say is that water will not be a constraining factor. Also, seller wants to eventually do a very high degree of just injecting pure phase CO2 underground as well. And then finally, land area, the advantage we have, especially in northern Kenya, is that it's a quite sparsely populated area where potential renewables installations like solar and others would not really conflict with other land uses. And so, of course, the key advantage of DAC, as opposed to say other methods, especially nature-based ones, is that we do not need arable land for our approach. And that is a key advantage to really scaling this to massive gigaton scale, because we can essentially go where there's very few other competing imperatives for any land use.
Thank you for quite a thorough answer. Can you talk a little bit about your revenue structures, and specifically, are you planning to sell carbon credits to companies and individuals? Are you looking at like that Climeworks model of selling to individuals?
Any individuals who are keen to buy from us, we please get in touch. Definitely happy to have a conversation. Funny enough, this morning, we actually just sold to our first individual, and very grateful for that to be so. That individual is a sort of prominent CDR face, but I won't mention the name here. And yeah, I think anyone who's keen to sort of buy from us, get in touch. For transparency, we are an early stage startup so far. We've mostly sold to corporates, like many CDR companies. So those processes are a bit more nascent on our side, but it is definitely something we are keen to push, because yes, it will take many people, and crucially, like getting that support from the community. It's something that we are incredibly keen on. So would love to hear from you.
Gotcha. Thank you. Likwa asked a question: what are the local community responses in Kenya, particular to direct air capture, particularly as an engineered solution? I know you already touched on this a little bit. Can you elaborate at all? Like engineered versus nature-based, how communities are receptive?
Yeah, no, great question. So we've talked to local communities who really have felt the effects of climate change a lot firsthand, right? And that can be a bit heart-wrenching, to be honest, because these are people where nobody in the community owns a car. None of these people has ever bought a liter of petrol in their lives, right? And yet they are the ones who are sort of made to suffer from this. And when you do go there and do the community engagement, you do get some pretty hard-hitting questions around, like, why isn't the West paying for this sort of stuff? Why are they just dumping their waste CO2 on us? So like, there's these pastoralist communities like the Maasai, where we showed a picture earlier, who, been living that lifestyle for hundreds of years, right? That really is like threatened from extinction. Like that culture is, really dying. Because frankly, there's ever less room to do pastoralism in Kenya. And so the reception to carbon removal in principle is fantastic. People love the idea that you can, for one, stop this from getting worse because it's already bad enough. But then the idea that you can sort of like restore the atmosphere to a state where it can support the type of lifestyle that it did for like a long time is very attractive. And then, as I said, like one thing that the communities were especially like receptive to is that, this is technology that is developed, built, and deployed in Kenya. It is not something that is like imposed on us, like by people from outside. It is really something that is driven by local innovators. And I think in that sense, it is just really important to like be able to sort of like, speak the language, so to say, of local communities, both literally and sort of metaphorically, and to understand, how, like the benefit sharing can work, and, like what the potential points of misinformation are. And there are some, there are some surrounding sort of geothermal, for example, and its impact on climate change, etc. And you really want to make sure you understand those concerns and can really like address them with your specific approach as well. So I think really being embedded into local communities is incredibly important to scaling that responsibly in Kenya. And like having that, breaking down that distinction between yourself and the community. And then beyond that, how does that compare to nature-based removals? Again, we see those working very much hand in hand. Kenya has a very active, carbon market 1.0, where Kenya is the like leading producer of carbon credits on the African continent. With great projects all over Kenya that really build nature-based both carbon removal and avoidance, and others that are doing great work in conservation and so on. At times, like the relationship between some of these communities and project developers has been a bit strained. And there's some thinking, especially that's now finding voice on a political level too, around how carbon revenue will actually be shared, and somewhat of a feeling that maybe the local communities are not seeing as much benefit as they should. It is a sort of difficult topic that will not wade in too much there, but we do see that by virtue of being a local company and by virtue of like having innovation that's driven by Kenyans and like built by Kenyans and deployed by Kenyans. I don't know, maybe I'm not in that position to speak to that, but point is that is very much what a team looks like. That I think that does make a big difference locally. And in that sense, I do think that the idea that we can innovate our way in some ways out of the worst of the climate crisis, and then that can itself create opportunity in a country like Kenya. I think that's finding quite receptive is. I think the promise of manufacturing and infrastructure and potential livelihoods that would create are real, and I think that is also like seen as something that can really like lift up the country and really like drive Kenya towards high income country status, which is ultimately what we're aiming for. Sorry, that was a long answer as well, but I hope it was insightful.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the time for our audience Q&A we have, so I'm going to kick it back to Mega.
Great, thank you guys so much. Okay, well, so next week we have Crew Carbon coming on. This is CDR, Joachim Kachinov. So please do join us for that, same time as always. We have a really exciting Carbon Crowd event tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, which is with Epiphi, which is sort of based off of some of the work Octavia has done, which is on open source direct air capture, September 7th. In a couple of weeks on European CDR. Seb did a really great event with us a couple of weeks ago, so he's going to give us an update, which is on September 7th, 11 Eastern. And then if we skip back forward, just the upcoming This Is CDR things that we have are with Group Carbon next week, as I said, Seaworthy on the 5th, Next Gen on the 12th. We have a break for New York Climate Week on the 19th. So we will then see you guys on the 26th to talk with Evitama, who will, I think, talk more about the UNFCCC process. And then we'll announce more in the next few weeks. So thanks for joining us as always, and look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, bye now.